Welcome everybody to this series where we are going to discuss the knee joint. Everybody should pretty much know what the knee joint is. So before we get into the topics and the actual detail of what this series is all about, I just want to kind of give you a rough overview of what the goal of this is. So first, I would like to teach coaches enough about each individual joint that you have enough of an understanding that you can have good dialogues with people that are medical practitioners or PTs or massage therapists, so that if you're working with an athlete or a person and they're going and they're outsourcing some of their body work and they think, that person that you're talking to thinks that you need to make adjustments to training to accommodate an injury or that there's some sort of swelling or inflammation in a certain place, that you have enough of a language to be able to understand that communication and have some sort of a process to expand your network out. I've seen a lot of times in CrossFit, one of the things that's good about it is that we can keep things a little bit simple. So you kind of keep things focused on functional movements and the things that you'll do in a day-to-day basis with regards to training technique, like technique of a squat snatch or technique of a wall ball or technique of a kipping pull-up. But oftentimes what gets in the way of that is somebody's joint resilience to be able to tolerate that. So this series concept, where we're starting with the knee and then hopefully going to go joint by joint to cover all of them over the course of the next however long it takes to get through them all, if this is a big hit and super helpful, is so that you have that language. Then, secondarily, as a coach, teaching you where your scope of practice is. So you're not a PT, you're not an orthopedic surgeon. So if there is a serious injury at any point, you're not going to be the person that takes over. But as we go through the process of training or, rehab, and let's say somebody's performance level is somewhere up here and they get injured, you have basically this massive crash of performance. So if we said this performance is somebody's max squat snatch and they rupture their ACL playing a flag football game, their standard level of knee performance on a squat is basically going to be going to zero. At some point in the rehabilitation process, the PTs that they're working with are going to start to turn this around, establish some sort of a baseline for movement. They're going to be able to do an air squat again. But if you look at this, there is still a huge performance gap from here where they were to here where the rehab process ends. So as a physical coach, as a sport coach, what your goal is basically to create this bridge that is a progressive and structured program that gets them back to their old performance level. And that process is really what I'd like to teach people to be able to do. This process of getting them from post-injury, post-acute injury phase into being able to do something is managed by PTs or medical practitioners, but the actual training process to get you back to performance is something that you can actually be helpful. And if you only know how to prescribe back squats and snatches and you don't understand the rehabilitation process and what's getting in the way of it, then I don't think you can ever really serve this. And you'd basically have to wait until somebody was back to being able to snatching and clean before you can write their physical training. So that's one goal. If you are a physical therapist or a medical practitioner, there's probably going to be a lot that we cover in this that is kind of just a refresher. And for CrossFit coaches, it might be a lot. So there might be a lot of terminology that you haven't heard before, might sound a little scientific. Sometimes it almost frustrates me that we got to talk about things that are really common. Like, everybody has joints, everybody has muscles, and they're literally in a language that is difficult to understand and you have to do education on. So that can be frustrating, but it is part of the process to really expand your lexicon so you can have communication with practitioners. The structure of the course, what we're going to cover in this video, it will be motion, bones, muscles, and ligaments. So that'll basically be the functional anatomy of the knee. Then in the second video, we'll talk about injury and pain. And I think that is a very, very important thing to know because that's generally what is going to inhibit people from continually training. Injuries and pain are just a common part of the process, especially if you're pushing yourself. And then the last video that'll kind of round out the series is rehab tools and a process for rehabilitation. So that's really where you get your actionable, practical takeaways about how to become a better coach. So let's jump into the anatomy. So we're going to cover motion as the first concept. Then we're going to cover bones. as a second concept. Then we are going to move into muscles, and hopefully I'm writing this all big enough and there's no major misspelling. And then we will cover ligaments. And I'll put some notes in here as I go under each one, so that way when we get to the end of this video, I can kind of give you a little recap. All of this information is in notes below, but I think it'll just kind of keep the flow of the dialogue a little bit better. So first, motion. What you'll oftentimes hear is the concept of being in the sagittal plane, and that's basically motion that is in flexion and extension. So here is my hip. If this were actually me, this would be my hip joint, and this is how my leg would be operating. So sagittal plane motion means that we are flexing and extending, and the joint at the knee is a hinge joint. So it would be like this, and that would be like a kicking motion. And this joint is relatively stable. It's just basically a hinge joint. Whereas the hip joint, you can see that's a ball and socket. There's a lot of different motion and a lot of planes of motion that can happen. This one is relatively flexed. It's relatively fixed. There's only going to be motion happening like a hinge. It would be like a door. If you look at a normal door, I'm pointing over there and you can't see it, they're on a hinge joint. So they just move like this in one plane of motion. That's very similar to the knee. What you'll also hear about in motion is valgus and varus. So valgus is when the knee tends to go towards the inside. So when you see somebody and they're squatting and their ankles rotate in and their knees go valgus, they're going inward. And then generally that is going to happen a little bit this way. So you'll get some compression forces on the outside of the knee and some extension and ligament stretching on the inside. But generally, to accommodate that motion, you're getting changes in the ankle joint, you're getting changes in the hip joint, and not all of that motion is actually coming from this. There's a little bit, but most of the joint is happening as flexion and extension. So there isn't really much frontal plane motion. It's all going to be primarily sagittal plane motion when you're talking about a knee joint. It's just flexing and extending. So motion, sagittal plane, flexion, extension, and then you have frontal plane, which is valgus, which I call in, and varus, which I call out. You do also have a tiny bit of rotational movement at the knee, and it's called the screw home mechanism. It's kind of hard to describe and it's hard to show on this, but basically as our knee goes into extension, there is some relative external rotation of the ankle and the lower leg to get you into extension. So if you kick and you're fully flexing out, generally the foot will turn out a little bit, which will create some relative external rotation of the lower leg and some relative internal rotation. And then the opposite is true if you're pulling in, where there's some internal rotation. So you might see if somebody's running, their foot as they go in will kind of turn inward a tiny bit as it's going through flexion and out as it's going through extension. And that's called the screw home mechanism. So if I go back, I don't know where I put my marker. Oh, let's put it over here. You have transverse plane, screw home mechanism. So you have a little bit of motion in transverse plane and frontal plane. Almost everything is happening in the sagittal plane. From there, we move into bones. And bones, you basically have four primary players that make up the knee. The first is this big upper leg. It's basically where your upper leg, it's, you know, underneath all of that muscle and fat and all of that tissue is your femur. It's big muscle. It's only one bone, or sorry, big bone. It's only one of them. Then your lower leg is comprised of a fibula, which is the lower leg small muscle, and the tibia, which is the larger muscle. Then there is a tiny muscle that's embedded in the patella tendon called the patella. And that is basically the 4 bones that make up the joint. So you'll see some injuries that happen to the lower leg in CrossFit because it's a non-contact sport. You're generally not going to see a lot of broken bones unless somebody's falling with a barbell or they fall from a box and land on something incorrectly. We'll see a lot more other types of injuries and pathologies, which I'll get into in the injuries and pathology section, but those would be the primary bones that you're looking at. And then when they talk about articulations, which is basically the points of the joint, you have the femoral patella, or the patellofemoral, which is basically where the patella and the femur meet. And then you have the tibia femoral, which is where the tibia meets with the femur. So you basically have 2 places in the joint that the bones intersect. So bones, we have femur, which is upper leg. We have tibia, which I'll call the big lower leg muscle or lower leg bone. Then you have the fibula, which is the little lower leg muscle. And then you have the patella, which is basically your kneecap. Those would be the bones that make up the knee joint. Then moving into the muscles, if we have a concept of this being the front of the leg, so this is the hip, it would be upright if you were standing, but for this model, I can't hold it, so it'll fall down. It's not how your actual hip would be. But if you have the front side of the leg, the back side of the leg, and this is the front side of the shin and the back side of the shin. The major muscles we're looking at are the quadricep, which is basically the big front muscle here, which would primarily be thought of as something that would extend the knee. So if you're going to kick, that quad muscle right here is going to be the primary thing, which is like why you see people that are really big squatters often having really big quads. It's not all the time, but just to kind of give you some sort of an idea. Then on the back side, you have the hamstring. And a lot of these are actually multiple muscles, but I'm not going to go into super detail on that. I'm going to show you an app that can help you discern all the different aspects of it. But I think if we can just break it down into a little bit more simplicity, it'll help you as a coach understand what muscles are operating in the knee. So hamstring is going to do the opposite of the quad, which is basically going to flex the leg. So if you are running and you're pulling your heel to your butt, the hamstring is going to be the primary thing that does that. Then on the back side of the calf, you have the gastroc, or the gastrocnemius. Not sure if I said that right, but it's basically the muscle that's at the top of the calf that would cross the knee joint. There's also some muscles in the back of the leg called the popliteus, and that'd be probably the last muscle that I think would be relevant in explaining it. And those would be the primary things that if somebody was having knee pain or muscular pain around the knee, that if you're talking to a PT, those are the words that you're gonna hear on a regular basis. Like, oh, they pulled one of the muscles of their quadricep, or they pulled one of the muscles inside of their hamstring. Those are gonna be the primary ones. There's a lot of other potential structures that could be involved that are upstream at the hip or downstream at the ankle that can affect knee pain. But I think if we keep it relatively simple and say we have the quad or quadricep, which is on the front and extends, then we have the hamstring, which is on the back and flexes. Wondering how many comments I'm going to get about the sloppiness of my handwriting, but hopefully my words and the text underneath will help that. Then we have the gastroc, which is back of the calf, and let me look at my screen to make sure I spell this right, Popliteus, which is back of the knee. Those would be the primary muscular structures. Then we have ligaments. Ligaments are basically what's connecting the soft tissue structures to the bones. So we have MCL, which is going to be on the inside of the knee. So MCL is going to operate on the inside of the knee, which is going to basically resist valgus. So your body needs to protect against this motion. If not, you just basically, anytime there was any force this way on your leg, your knee would collapse, rip open, and rip these structures completely, off to the side, and these bones would hit one another. So there's some ligaments on this side, which would be the MCL on the inside of my knee. So this would be my right leg on this side that restrict that opening motion. Then we have the LCL on the opposite side, which restricts the opposite motion. So that way you don't become so bow-legged that your basically femur explodes out to the side. Then we have the ACL on the front side, which resists forward translation. So that's why oftentimes if there's a non-contact injury and somebody's sprinting forward and goes to stop and decelerate, that way you'd have that massive shift forward and can rupture the ACL. And then your PCL is on the back. So we think of it like there's ligament protection around the joint in every capacity. So we have ACL, PCL, MCL, and LCL. And I like to think of A as being anterior is the front, P is posterior, which is the back, M is medial, which is the inside, and L is lateral, which is the outside. So that can kind of give you some sort of an understanding of all of the ligaments that are in the joint. So that concludes the first video. So it's motion, bones, muscles, and ligaments. Those are basically all the structures that you have to know. Now, Chris, I'm gonna need this camera pointed over there so I could show. One thing that I wanna make sure that people understand is that the process of learning about anatomy is not something, if you're a coach, that needs to constantly be in the forefront of your understanding. Why? Because there's other stuff that we need to know. Human communication, technique of all the lifts, and your memory can only process and hold on to so much information. So one thing that you can do that can help you with this process. So that way, if somebody ever says, hey, your athlete has some issue with their MCL and you're kind of confused about what that means and what it does and what that might mean for training, one thing that I like to do is I have a health app that's called iMuscle 2. It's shown on the screen if I click up, and it's basically just a human skeletal and muscular system. And if I go in here and I zoom in, I'm gonna zoom in on a leg since we're covering the knee, and I click on any muscle, this will show me the specific muscle. So this is vastus medialis. It's one of the muscles that would be part of the quad. And it'll tell me what movements that this muscle is primarily engaged in, what stretches you could do to potentially stretch this muscle, some secondary movements where it might potentially do something, but it's not the primary mover. And as you're going through this, you can cut away tissues, so that way you can get deeper down into the joint. You can click on these soft tissues and understand what these muscles are. I think having this at your disposal and understanding that you can have this language of anatomy in your pocket without having it memorized in your brain can just be helpful as a coach to understand the knee. So just quick review, motion primarily in the sagittal plane. So the knee is going to flex and extend. In a kicking motion primarily, you have 4 major bones that you're considering: femur, tibia, fibula, patella. Your muscle structures primarily are grouped in as bigger groups of muscles that would go into quad, then hamstring, then gastroc, then popliteus, and then your 4 major ligaments are ACL, PCL, MCL, and LCL. So anytime you're dealing with an injury, anytime you're working with a bodybuilder that's trying to work on a specific part of their body, understanding these concepts can help you write more effective training. And in the next video, we're gonna jump into injuries, which is primarily what you're doing as a coach when somebody's coming to you with something specific and it's related to a joint like the knee. What you just watched is a series I created for the training think tank classroom called Biomechanics of the Knee. That was video 1. If you'd like to watch videos 2 and 3 and a full podcast style discussion with Brandon Dorman reviewing the series, all of that can be found in the classroom along with other content from this month's drop, including a book review on a book called The Man Who Touched His Own Heart, a program design review on how to rehab and train around a knee injury in the sport of CrossFit, and a group research project on scoring in the sport of CrossFit and if there's a more efficient way to do that. For a 7-day free trial, head over to trainingthinktank.com/classroom trial.